So this is a bit of an impromptu one. I was just having a discussion about this, and I wanted to work my thoughts out on it as I talk about it. And that's why I'm doing a video after work instead of during my lunch break, which is why I'm wearing my spiffy cloak. It's not just to show off my spiffy cloak, though it is pretty spiffy. So I want to talk about ability scores in Dungeons & Dragons and how they're a little weird in as far as they don't really behave like attributes would in other games, or that attributes do in other games. And like I've observed this in the past, and I don't think I've ever really articulated why I think this or in what way they are different, but they do feel tangibly different. Let me tell you what I'm talking about here. So in D&D, you usually have certain ability scores that are important to your class, certain ability scores that are important in general. And you usually have some sort of a budget for your modifiers. This is if you are doing point buy. If you're doing rolling for stats, this doesn't really apply quite as much, though you will still feel these effects later on. So like, let's say you are a wizard. You value intelligence. How valuable is intelligence to anyone who is not a wizard or an artificer, I suppose? But artificers are like, they're expansion content, so I don't count them. So like, you know, how important is intelligence? What is intelligence used for? It's used for a few skills, mostly knowledge type skills. And other than that, there's like, you saving throws versus psychic stuff, maybe? Pretty rare. So like intelligence is really just there for the wizard, if you think about it. And then it is quite important for the wizard, or at least to get to a certain threshold. In 5th edition, usually +3 is considered like the threshold for like your stat is high enough to function. And then there's stuff like Dex, which adds to AC and to initiative. And so that's always useful. That's useful for everybody, except for heavy armor users. Even then, adds to initiative, and Dex saves are a very common save. So, like, Dex is always useful. Constitution, always useful. Hit points, always good. Everyone should have at least a +2 con, +3 if you can afford it. But then, like, ability scores otherwise are kind of like, it's just if your class cares about it. And that's a little weird. And it's different than most other RPGs that I've played, where like your stats, in as far as like what you are putting your points into and like which skills and attributes you are investing in, is largely a matter of personal expression. I'll give you the example of Legend of the Five Rings, where the 5 elements are roughly analogous to your stats, kind of. Like it's certainly not a 1-for-1 correspondence, and they don't represent like your physical or mental characteristics. They represent your character's tendencies to take certain approaches to the problems that they want to solve. You know, these elemental approaches. Fire is very passionate, very quick, very inspired, very creative. Water is more like smooth and like going with the flow, and my cloak just came undone. You know, those kinds of things. So they're not really attributes per se, but they serve the same mechanical purpose as being these sort of like high level character stats that then interact with a list of skills. Blades in the Dark doesn't have that sort of multi-tier thing. It does have attributes, something that's called attributes. Really, they could be thought of more like your saving throws, kind of, because they're not used in conjunction with skills. They're only used for resisting consequences, which is kind of like what a saving throw is, kind of. It's really not a good analogy, but we'll go with it. But like you do have a list of skills, or they're called action ratings, but you could also call them skills. In general gaming parlance, they would be called skills. And you sort of pick what you want to put your points into as you level up. And you tend to level up the categories of skills that you use more often. So if you're doing a lot of social stuff, you're going to be increasing your sway and your command and so on. Like those are going to get increased just naturally more than others, just because of the way that the leveling up system works in that. But like, so I would give the example in that of like the Whisper character, the playbook that is supposed to be, the magic focused one, the arcanist, the guy who deals with rituals and with ghosts and that kind of thing. The spooky one, which you would think would really push you towards investing into the attune action, which is sort of like the catch-all, you're doing spooky stuff action. But basically every Whisper that I've ever seen starts putting points into skirmish because it's also a good idea to be able to fight. And that's not something you see in a lot of other RPGs where like the magic character also wants to be able to fight really well. In D&D, like your ability scores are so tight and they increase at such cost, you can't really afford to diversify. And if you could, the numbers matter too much that it would really throw off character identity. There's only 6 of them. And so if you're good at too many of those, then you become good at functionally everything. This is, of course, discounting the fact that most of a character's power comes from their spellcasting feature, which sometimes cares what your stat is. Basically, if you're calling for saving throws or making spell attacks, anyways, that's a whole other thing. Basically, if you're doing those things, then you kind of care what your spellcasting stat is. Otherwise, generally speaking, con is the most important stat. And if you're good at con, you're golden. If you're good enough, really. It's just an interesting dynamic that D&D has specifically that other RPGs that are not related to D&D don't really seem to have. It feels very different. The relationship that players have to the stats that their characters, they're sort of like high-level base stats from which other things are derived. You have a different relationship to them in D&D than you do in other RPGs. Powered by the Apocalypse has sort of this, list of stats that looks at first glance very much like a set of ability scores. What with their, basically -1 to +3 range, which is kind of similar to what you would see in D&D. And they are used quite similarly. They are added, you roll your dice, add your relevant stat, and that's your total. But even then, the approach to how those stats are determined is quite different because D&D seems to take this almost, I would almost call it dishonest approach that like you can have your stats be whatever you want. But if you don't assign them correctly, you are gimping your character and you're going to be much less effective. The wizard who dumps intelligence, quite a meme, but like, what are you doing? Like how effective are you going to be in the game? And D&D doesn't really have a lot of ways for characters to interact other than in being effective. To interact with the world, I should say. You can, socially interact with each other. There's the meme of the half-orc bard who dumps charisma and it exists for a reason. I don't know. I guess it's some people's cup of tea. It's not mine. Just like, I guess it really comes down to like you can be a bad character in D&D, but I've made this point before. It kind of sucks. Being completely ineffective it's a bad time because D&D doesn't really support any kind of play, doesn't mechanically support any kind of play other than tackling obstacles and overcoming them, whether that be enemies or traps or puzzles or what have you. Certainly you can build a campaign where that is a thing, but you are going outside of the bounds of the rules. The game does not come packaged able to do that. And so because of all of these factors, it creates a situation where you kind of are required to assign ability scores according to certain values. And there's a little bit of wiggle room. Like maybe you have a +3 in one stat and a +2 in another, or maybe you have those swapped. But like, those are relatively minor adjustments. And it's quite uncommon in the tabletop RPG market. Most RPGs that I have played don't do that. Like, you are a lot more free to assign your stats as you please, to personalize your character, and really approach the game from different directions with regards what your character is capable of doing well. And that's why I think that D&D's ability scores and the way that it interacts with them, the way that they are used, is kind of, like, I don't want to outright say bad, but it is quite unintuitive from the perspective of the general RPG market. And as someone who is currently developing a system that uses those stats in a different way, I can see sort of tangentially, I'm like skirting the bounds of where that becomes like a design problem. I'm not quite tackling the design problem head on because I am writing it in a different way. Like the way that Legends and Lore approaches the ability scores is very different than the way that D&D approaches ability scores. But it's close enough that I can really see what the problem is from, like, not quite an outsider's perspective. I'm like almost getting my nails into it. And it's just really interesting, and I feel like D&D is hamstringing itself with this approach. It would make more sense design-wise if you were to start over from scratch and not have a lot of the traditional baggage that D&D has with regards to its design, which will never happen. But if you could, then I would say to reevaluate how the ability scores interact with class abilities. And I would say class abilities probably should be mostly divorced from the ability scores in terms of their effectiveness, if you want ability scores to be truly customizable. Because right now, they feel pretty forced. Like, you only have enough resources, doing point buy, of course, to invest in, good scores, so many of them. English being construct language of incorrect order. You only have enough points to have so many good ability scores, and the rest of them kind of have to be dump stats. 11 or less, pretty much a dump stat. So that's what I'm getting at. D&D's approach to ability scores is quite different than most RPGs. It's quite restrictive, and it's arguably not very good design-wise. And this kind of goes for 4th edition as well. You have your one primary ability score, and you have one secondary ability score. Sometimes you have an extra secondary. Very rarely you have an extra primary. In a few cases, like in the original Player's Handbook. They stopped doing that, I think, in later books. And those are the stats you care about. And you really don't care about... It's not that you don't care about, actually. It's that you can't really afford to invest in other ability scores. And so they kind of fall by the wayside. It has certain mechanical pieces that help to mitigate that. For example, the fact that you're adding half your level to everything, plus as far as stat or your skills go, the +5 flat bonus to all your trained skills usually overcomes the difference in ability scores up to a certain point. But it doesn't really go all the way. Like, by the time you get into the higher levels, there's definitely a difference between what is your good stat and what is your bad stat, as is intended. Like, I think that's part of the design intention. But it does become an issue if you want to have a character that values certain like abilities, not abilities, but certain tendencies, like skills, over, like, that aren't part of their stat. If the wizard is investing in intelligence and dexterity for their class skills, but they also want to be good at athletics. I'm a young, fit wizard. I can still hop over a ledge. well, that's a strength skill, so you better be packing a spell, because by the time you get to mid Paragon tier, you just can't really, you cannot keep up. Because the difference between the characters with the good ability scores for that skill and the characters with the bad ability scores for that skill just becomes too great. So this is a problem. I mean, it's not even necessarily a problem. I think calling it a problem would be overselling it. This is an issue, let us say. It's relatively minor. But it's an issue that I don't think ever will be fixed, because it's so perfectly ingrained in something that has been part of D&D for a very long time. It has become tradition. I think people would complain and they would notice in a negative way if this were ever changed or removed in a way that would have to be in order to open these things up. So that's my take on ability scores and why they're kind of weird and they don't really work like attributes do in other games.